The HOA president, who tried to steal my house. They said I couldn't paint my front door blue. That was just the beginning. By the end of this story, I owned their president's house and turned the HOA into the most democratic neighborhood association in the state. But let me start from when Richard Blackwood first knocked on my door with that fake smile and a violation notice that would change everything. Picture this. It's 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. I'm working from home, debugging code for a fintech startup, when someone starts pounding on my door like they're serving a warrant. I open it to find this guy in a three-piece suit despite it being 85 degrees outside, holding a clipboard like it's Excalibur and wearing the kind of smile that makes used car salesmen look trustworthy. "Mr. Chen," he says, not waiting for me to confirm my identity, "I'm Richard Blackwood, president of Maple Grove HOA. We need to discuss your recent decorative choices." He gestures toward my front door like it's covered in graffiti instead of a fresh coat of navy blue paint that I'd spent my weekend carefully applying. The color I'd specifically chosen because it matched the ocean view from my childhood home in Santa Barbara before my parents lost everything in the 2008 crash and we had to start over. "Is there a problem with my door?" I ask, genuinely confused because I'd checked the HOA guidelines 3 times before buying the paint. Richard's smile gets wider and somehow more menacing. Section 4.7 clearly states that all exterior colors must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. That's a $500 fine, increasing by $100 daily until compliance. Here's where it gets interesting. I pull out my phone and open the PDF of our actual HOA covenants that I downloaded when I bought the house 6 months ago. "Can you show me Section 4.7? I ask, scrolling through the document. Because I'm only seeing sections 4.1 through 4.5. The silence that follows is so complete you could hear a pin drop in my neighbor's garage. Richard's face goes through this fascinating transformation, like watching a computer blue screen in real time while making those grinding sounds that mean your hard drive just died. "The guidelines were recently updated," he finally says, but his voice has that quality people get when they're making things up on the spot. "All residents should have received notification." I hadn't received any notification, neither had my neighbors, as I'd discover later, but Richard was just getting started on what would become the most insane power trip in suburban history. Let me back up and explain how I ended up living next to a man who thought he was running a homeowners association, like his personal fiefdom. 8 months earlier, I was David Chen, newly promoted senior software engineer at a Bay Area startup, finally making enough money to escape apartment living and buy my first house. The settlement for my previous company's acquisition gave me enough for a down payment on a modest craftsman bungalow in Maple Grove, one of those established neighborhoods that promised mature trees, quiet streets, and reasonable HOA fees. What the real estate agent didn't mention was that reasonable HOA fees came with unreasonable HOA leadership. I chose this neighborhood specifically because I was tired of hearing my upstairs neighbors' conversations through paper-thin walls and wanted space to set up a proper home office where I could take client calls without background noise from a busy street. After years of Silicon Valley apartment living where privacy was a luxury and parking was warfare, the idea of having my own driveway and backyard felt like winning the lottery. The house was perfect for my needs. 2 bedrooms, 1 converted to an office, updated kitchen, and a backyard where I could finally try growing the tomatoes my grandmother had taught me about before she passed. Maple Grove looked like the American dream with a reasonable price tag. 73 homes built in the early 2000s, mostly young professionals and established families. The kind of place where people actually knew their neighbors' names instead of just avoiding eye contact in the hallways. The HOA dues were $120 monthly, covering landscaping maintenance for common areas and a small community fund for neighborhood improvements. Most residents seemed genuinely friendly during my first few weeks. Elderly couple named the Johnsons next door who brought me leftover lasagna that actually tasted homemade. Young family called the Martinez across the street, whose kids immediately started including me in their sidewalk basketball games. Everyone seemed refreshingly normal, which should have been my first warning that something was lurking beneath all that suburban tranquility. I spent my first 6 months transforming the house into exactly what I'd always wanted, partly because it needed some updates, and partly because staying busy with home improvement projects kept me focused on building something positive instead of dwelling on the startup stress that had burned out half my former colleagues. Fresh paint throughout, hardwood floors refinished, smart home system installed, and that blue front door that would trigger everything that followed. The door color wasn't random. Navy blue had been my grandmother's favorite color, and painting it felt like honoring her memory while making the house truly mine. I'd specifically researched HOA guidelines before buying the paint, found nothing prohibiting the color, and assumed I was good to go. The idea that someone would fabricate rules to retroactively fine me never crossed my mind because I still believed people generally operated in good faith. That belief died the day Richard showed up with his fake violation notice. Richard Blackwood had been HOA president for 4 years running, mostly because he treated the position like a full-time job while everyone else had actual careers. He lived in the largest house on the corner lot, drove a black Mercedes with vanity plates reading "Leader" like some kind of suburban dictator, and had a wife who traveled constantly for pharmaceutical sales. The neighborhood kids called him Clipboard Man, behind his back, and parents crossed the street to avoid conversations that inevitably turned into lectures about property values and community standards. His approach to HOA leadership was what you might call authoritarian micromanagement. He measured grass height with an actual measuring tape, photographed residents' cars to ensure they were parked precisely within driveway boundaries, and kept a detailed spreadsheet of every minor infraction he could manufacture. Most people just paid his fines rather than fight them, because who has time to argue with a man who clearly has nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for problems? But I wasn't most people. My background in software engineering had taught me to trace problems back to their source code, and Richard's operation had more bugs than a beta release. 2 days after our door confrontation, I received an official violation notice in the mail, printed on letterhead that looked expensive but felt slightly off, like a really good counterfeit. The letter demanded $500 for unauthorized exterior modification, plus $50 in administrative processing fees, with payment due within 10 days, or face additional penalties. I spent that evening doing what any good engineer does when encountering unexpected behavior. I debugged the system. I requested copies of all HOA documents from the management company, cross-referenced them with county records, and discovered something fascinating. The updated guidelines Richard had referenced didn't exist anywhere in our legal governing documents. Section 4.7 was pure fiction. More interesting, our actual covenants required any rule changes to be voted on by residents with 30-day advance notice. Richard had been making up regulations and enforcing them like law for who knows how long, essentially running a protection racket disguised as community management. Most people would probably pay the fake fine rather than research municipal housing law, which is exactly what Richard was counting on. But my college roommate had been pre-law, and he drilled into my head that documentation beats intimidation every time. So I started building a case. The neighborhood awakening began when I printed flyers titled "Your Neighbor, Who Actually Reads the Fine Print," and distributed them to every mailbox except Richard's. I included copies of our real governing documents alongside Richard's fake violations, highlighting the sections that proved his fines had no legal basis. The response was immediate and eye-opening. Mrs. Johnson approached me the next morning while I was checking my mail, speaking in whispers like we were planning an underground resistance movement. "We got violation letters too," she said, glancing around nervously. "Apparently our garden gnomes violate aesthetic standards that don't exist anywhere in the actual bylaws." The Martinez family stopped by that evening with their own story. Richard had cited them for excessive outdoor decorations, which turned out to be string lights on their patio that created what he called light pollution. They'd been afraid to fight it because English wasn't their first language and they worried about drawing negative attention. That's when I realized Richard's scam was bigger than my blue door. He'd been systematically targeting residents with fake violations, collecting thousands in illegal fines, and using intimidation tactics to prevent anyone from questioning his authority. What I thought was a personal dispute was actually a widespread fraud operation disguising itself as community governance. The breaking point came when Richard escalated from fake fines to real harassment. He started parking outside my house during my client video calls, revving his Mercedes engine precisely when I needed quiet for important meetings. He filed noise complaints with the city about my excessive typing during what he claimed were quiet hours that existed nowhere in our community rules. But his biggest mistake was targeting my work directly. Richard contacted my employer claiming I was running an illegal business from my home office, violating zoning laws and HOA regulations. The complaint was completely false. I was a remote employee, not running a business, but it forced me to waste half a day explaining the situation to HR while Richard accomplished his goal of disrupting my professional life. That's when I stopped playing defense and started building offense. I installed security cameras covering my property perimeter, perfectly legal since they only monitored my own land. More importantly, I started attending HOA meetings for the first time since moving in. Those pathetic monthly gatherings where Richard talked to himself while 2 board members nodded like dashboard bobbleheads in an earthquake. The meetings were educational in the worst possible way. Richard operated them like a corporate CEO, addressing shareholders, presenting monthly reports that were mostly him congratulating himself on maintaining property values through aggressive enforcement. Questions from residents were discouraged, dissent was ignored, and votes were predetermined outcomes rubber-stamped by his loyalists. But I brought something Richard wasn't expecting: actual knowledge of parliamentary procedure and a digital recorder. "I'd like to see the budget breakdown for this year's expenditures," I said during my first meeting, speaking clearly for my recording device. Richard's response was pure deflection. "Financial details are handled by the management company. Residents don't need to concern themselves with administrative complexities." "Actually," I continued, pulling out my printed copy of state HOA law, California Civil Code. Section 5200 requires all common interest developments to provide detailed financial reports to homeowners upon request. I'm formally requesting those documents." The silence that followed was so uncomfortable you could feel the room's collective realization that someone had finally asked the emperor to show his clothes. Richard's face went through several color changes while his brain processed the implications of someone actually knowing the law. "We'll follow up on that request," he finally managed, but his voice had lost its usual authoritative confidence. That night, my research took a darker turn. I started tracking Richard's financial connections and discovered a web of conflicts of interest that made his fake violations look like small-scale theft. The management company he'd hired was owned by his brother-in-law. The landscaping contractor was his neighbor. Even the attorney who'd written our updated guidelines was his former college roommate. Every dollar our HOA spent was flowing directly into Richard's extended family network, turning our community fees into a personal enrichment scheme that would make municipal corruption investigators salivate. The retaliation began immediately. The next morning, my car got ticketed for a commercial vehicle violation, despite being a Honda Civic parked in my own driveway. Tuesday brought a surprise visit from code enforcement investigating anonymous complaints about unpermitted home office modifications. The inspector spent 20 minutes examining my completely legal setup before apologizing for the waste of time. Wednesday was when things got weird. Richard started his daily neighborhood safety patrols, which consisted of him slowly driving past my house while talking loudly on his phone about suspicious residents and declining property values. Thursday brought a certified letter claiming my security cameras violated community privacy standards that once again existed nowhere in our actual governing documents. But something beautiful was happening while Richard was trying to intimidate me into submission. Other residents were connecting the dots and realizing they weren't alone in fighting his manufactured violations. Mrs. Johnson started documenting Richard's harassment with timestamps and photos. The Martinez family began recording their interactions with him. Even quiet Mr. Peterson from the end of the street approached me with stories about Richard's attempts to fine him for having guests park on the street during his daughter's birthday party. Richard had made his first strategic error. He'd shown everyone that they were all fighting the same bully instead of isolated individual problems. The community organizing happened organically when neighbors started talking to each other instead of suffering in silence. We discovered that Richard had collected over $15,000 in fake fines during the past year alone, money that had disappeared into administrative costs and special projects that benefited no one except his financial network. More damaging, we learned that our HOA was supposed to be managed by a professional company, but Richard had been handling most functions himself while still paying the management fees to his brother-in-law's firm. Essentially, we were paying twice for services that Richard was providing for free in order to maintain control over the money flow. The emergency community meeting I organized drew 31 residents to the library conference room, more engagement than our HOA had seen in years. The smell of institutional coffee mixed with nervous energy as people shared stories about Richard's systematic abuse of authority. When I presented our findings about the financial irregularities and fake violations, you could hear a pin drop except for the occasional gasp as people realized how completely they'd been scammed. Mrs. Johnson stood up with her documentation of harassment incidents. The Martinez family explained how they'd been afraid to question obvious rule violations because of language barriers and intimidation tactics. But the moment that changed everything came when Eleanor Patterson, a retired accountant who'd been quietly reviewing HOA finances, revealed her bombshell discovery. "I've been auditing our books," she announced, producing a thick folder of financial documents, "and I found evidence of systematic embezzlement totaling approximately $47,000 over the past 3 years. The room erupted in whispers as Eleanor explained how Richard had been creating fake expenses, inflating contractor bills and funneling HOA funds through shell companies owned by his relatives. What we thought was just petty tyranny was actually organized financial fraud on a scale that could result in federal charges. Richard's absence from this crucial meeting spoke volumes about his awareness that his house of cards was collapsing. Neighbors reported seeing a moving truck at his house that morning, suggesting he might be preparing for a hasty exit strategy. The vote to remove Richard from office and demand full financial restitution was unanimous among the 31 households present. More importantly, we voted to hire an independent management company and implement transparent financial reporting that would prevent future abuse. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight that would test our community's resolve in ways none of us anticipated. The counterattack came like a corporate lawyer's fever dream. Richard hired Marcus Stone, a litigation specialist who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, to file harassment lawsuits against 7 residents involved in our community organizing efforts. The strategy was elegantly brutal. Bankrupt the opposition through legal fees before the embezzlement case could proceed. Each lawsuit demanded $50,000 in damages for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, supported by carefully edited evidence that made our legitimate complaints look like a coordinated attack on an innocent volunteer. Richard had been documenting our interactions with professional-grade equipment, building a legal defense while we thought we were just fighting fake fines. The media blitz began simultaneously with Richard calling local news stations claiming he was the victim of a neighborhood mob targeting a dedicated community volunteer. He arrived for interviews wearing his most sympathetic outfit and provided footage that made him look like a suburban saint under siege by unstable residents. But desperation makes people careless, and Richard was operating in full panic mode. His private investigator was asking my employer inappropriate questions about my work performance and mental stability. Anonymous complaints flooded the state contractor licensing board, questioning my home office setup despite being completely legal. Most disturbing, someone reported my suspicious behavior to local police, forcing me to explain to Officer Martinez why I was documenting interactions with my HOA president. "We get calls about this neighborhood monthly," Martinez told me privately. "Same complainant every time, different residents accused of various violations, never any real evidence. Thought you should know someone's weaponizing our department." That's when everything clicked into place. Richard hadn't just been embezzling money and fabricating violations. He'd been using municipal services as weapons against anyone who questioned his authority, turning taxpayer-funded departments into his personal enforcement arm. The community siege intensified as Richard's legal team sent threatening letters to anyone who'd attended our library meeting, demanding they cease all conspiracy activities or face individual lawsuits that would cost more than most families' annual income. Eleanor faced an Adult Protective Services investigation claiming she was being manipulated by unstable neighbors. The Martinez family discovered someone had reported them to immigration authorities despite being American citizens longer than I'd been alive. Richard's willingness to destroy innocent families, including elderly neighbors and legal immigrants, revealed the true scope of his moral bankruptcy. But his scorched earth tactics were backfiring spectacularly because they were radicalizing previously neutral residents who'd been content to ignore HOA drama until it knocked on their doors. The financial warfare was working temporarily. Legal bills were mounting like credit card debt during a gambling addiction as residents collectively spent $8,000 monthly fighting lawsuits designed to drain resources rather than resolve anything. Most working families can't sustain legal battles indefinitely, which is exactly what Richard was counting on. Then Richard made the mistake that transformed community annoyance into parental fury and media attention. He approached my neighbor's 10-year-old daughter at the school bus stop, offering her candy while asking questions about her parents, friends who caused trouble in the neighborhood. Multiple parents witnessed this interaction and immediately reported it to school administrators, who banned Richard from all school property faster than you can say inappropriate contact with minors. When concerned parents started comparing notes, they discovered Richard had been systematically approaching children throughout the neighborhood, gathering intelligence about their families' activities and relationships. The pattern suggested someone who'd crossed the line from HOA abuse into potential predatory behavior that threatened the safety of our children. The community response was like watching a sleeping giant wake up and flex its muscles. Parents organized escort rotations for school activities. Residents began systematically documenting every interaction with Richard. Local reporters started investigating the financial irregularities after tips from multiple sources. But the breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source: Richard's own paper trail. Eleanor's forensic accounting had uncovered something bigger than simple embezzlement. Richard had been running a sophisticated fraud operation that involved creating fake vendors, inflating maintenance contracts, and billing our HOA for services that were never performed. The money trail showed payments to shell companies that existed only on paper, while actual community maintenance was handled by the cheapest possible contractors. More damaging, Richard had been collecting duplicate payments for the same services, essentially charging our HOA twice for everything while pocketing the difference through his network of fake companies. The total theft exceeded $73,000 over 4 years, money that could have funded significant community improvements instead of financing Richard's luxury lifestyle. Patricia Williams, the forensic accountant Eleanor hired, delivered the evidence that would end Richard's reign of terror permanently. "This isn't just HOA mismanagement," Patricia explained during our emergency meeting. "This is organized fraud on a scale that triggers federal prosecution. Your HOA president has been running a criminal enterprise disguised as community management." The FBI Financial Crimes Unit took our case seriously, because Richard's operation involved mail fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering activities that crossed state lines through his fake vendor network. Agent Sarah Rodriguez explained that community association fraud was becoming increasingly common as real estate values made HOA accounts attractive targets for sophisticated theft operations. People like Richard count on community apathy and the assumption that HOA disputes are civil matters, Agent Rodriguez told us, but systematic financial fraud is federal crime regardless of the venue where it occurs. The federal investigation moved with the swift efficiency of government machinery finally clicking into gear. Richard was arrested at 6 a.m. on charges including wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. His luxury lifestyle was revealed as a house of cards built on stolen community funds that should have been improving our neighborhood instead of financing his Mercedes payments. But the arrest was just the beginning of Richard's legal problems. The IRS discovered he'd failed to report the stolen HOA funds as income, adding tax evasion to his growing list of federal charges. The state licensing board revoked his real estate license after learning about the fraud conviction. Even his homeowner's insurance canceled his policy after discovering the criminal charges. The recovery process was more complex than we'd anticipated because Richard had spent most of the stolen money, leaving our HOA treasury depleted while facing enormous legal bills for cleanup and recovery. The federal court ordered full restitution, but Richard's assets were tied up in legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. That's where our community organizing skills proved valuable in ways we'd never expected. Instead of waiting for federal prosecutors to recover our money, we organized a neighborhood investment cooperative that pooled resources for immediate improvements while the legal case proceeded. Every household contributed according to their ability, creating a fund that exceeded $35,000 for projects that had been delayed by Richard's theft. The psychological transformation was remarkable. Residents who'd been afraid to attend HOA meetings became engaged community stakeholders excited about democratic participation. People started hosting block parties, organizing youth activities, and taking genuine pride in our neighborhood's appearance because they finally had a voice in how things were managed. Eleanor volunteered to serve as interim HOA president while we searched for professional management that would prevent future abuse. Her background in accounting and her experience uncovering Richard's fraud made her the obvious choice for rebuilding transparent financial systems. The new management company we hired specialized in community recovery after board dysfunction, with 15 years' experience helping neighborhoods heal from exactly our type of situation. Their services included transparent financial reporting, professional meeting facilitation, and guaranteed compliance with state regulations. For the first time in years, residents were excited about HOA finances instead of dreading them. Transparency works magic, transforming suspicious neighbors into engaged community stakeholders who actually want to participate in local governance because they know their voices matter and their money is being handled responsibly. The federal courthouse on that crisp November morning looked like the set of a legal drama, except the reporters weren't actors and the 20-plus Maple Grove residents filling the gallery represented months of community organizing finally reaching its conclusion. The smell of institutional coffee mixed with nervous anticipation as our entire neighborhood held its collective breath. Richard shuffled into the courtroom wearing an orange detention jumpsuit that made him look like a deflated version of the three-piece suit dictator who'd tried to find me for painting my door blue. His transformation was so complete that several neighbors didn't recognize him until he sat down at the defendant's table. FBI agent Rodriguez presented the government's case with methodical precision that made Richard's fraud operation look like organized crime with better landscaping. Evidence tables displayed printed financial records, fake invoices, and bank statements that painted 4 years of systematic theft in overwhelming detail. The prosecution recommended 18 months federal prison plus full restitution of $73,000. But Richard's attorney delivered a surprise that nobody anticipated. His client was cooperating fully with authorities and providing information about similar fraud operations in other HOA communities throughout the region. Apparently, Richard's scheme wasn't unique. Federal investigators had discovered a network of corrupt HOA board members sharing tactics for embezzling community funds through fake vendor arrangements. Richard's cooperation was helping prosecute a multi-state operation that had stolen hundreds of thousands from working families who trusted their neighborhood leadership. When Judge Harrison called for victim impact statements, I approached the podium carrying a folder of community testimonials from residents whose lives had been affected by Richard's abuse. "Your Honor, I used to think this case was about fake violations and stolen money," I began, feeling the weight of our entire community's experience on my shoulders. But standing here today, I realize it was actually about what happens when unchecked authority corrupts ordinary people and how communities can choose healing over revenge when given the opportunity. I described the fear, the financial stress, the systematic intimidation that had poisoned our neighborhood for years. but I also talked about what we'd learned about ourselves and democratic participation. We discovered that ordinary people can build extraordinary solidarity when they're fighting for something bigger than individual grievances, I said, and several reporters started taking notes about the community organizing aspects of our story. Eleanor's statement delivered the moment that would make national news. She approached the podium with quiet authority earned through months of forensic accounting and community leadership. "Your Honor, Mr. Blackwood didn't just steal money from working families," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who documented every detail of systematic fraud. "He violated the fundamental principle that authority exists to serve communities, not to exploit them for personal gain." Judge Harrison's sentence reflected both the severity of financial crimes and our community's advocacy for rehabilitation over pure punishment. 15 months supervised release with mandatory restitution, community service focused on HOA transparency education, and permanent prohibition from serving on any community association board. The court notes that victims advocating for constructive rather than purely punitive resolution demonstrates the kind of community character that makes democracy resilient, the judge said, and I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. The financial recovery exceeded our expectations because federal prosecutors had frozen Richard's assets before he could spend everything. We recovered $68,000 in direct restitution, plus an additional $31,000 from liquidating assets purchased with stolen HOA funds. But more importantly, our ordeal had attracted attention from community organizing specialists who helped us implement democratic reforms that would prevent future abuse. We adopted transparent budgeting, professional management oversight, and resident education programs that turned our HOA into a model for other communities recovering from board dysfunction. 6 months after the courthouse victory, Maple Grove Estates was featured in Community Leadership magazine as a case study in successful democratic reform following financial fraud. Property values had increased not because we'd gotten rid of Richard, but because we'd proven that ordinary neighbors could solve extraordinary problems through organized civic participation. The transformation still amazes me when I drink coffee on my back patio, looking out at the community garden we built where Richard used to hold his intimidating compliance meetings. Our recovery fund had become sustainable financing for genuine improvements that residents actually wanted, rather than projects that benefited connected contractors. My blue front door had become a neighborhood symbol of successful resistance to arbitrary authority. Several neighbors painted their doors similar colors in solidarity, creating a visual reminder that communities thrive when residents have genuine voice in governance rather than just submitting to whatever rules board members decide to invent. The annual Blue Door Day celebration had become our neighborhood's favorite tradition, marking not Richard's defeat but our community's discovery of its own democratic potential. This year's block party filled the entire street with children playing, parents discussing genuine community issues, and teenagers who chose to hang out in our neighborhood rather than escape to the mall. Eleanor's expertise in financial transparency had transformed her into a regional consultant, helping 12 other communities navigate similar reforms without the legal drama we'd endured. "Conflict is democracy trying to find its voice," she'd tell frustrated residents, and her success rate was remarkable because she understood that most HOA disputes stem from lack of genuine participation rather than actual disagreement about community priorities. Richard's recovery updates came through court-mandated restitution reports, and they were surprisingly positive rather than just legally required documentation. He was working with a nonprofit that helped communities implement transparent governance while pursuing certification in conflict resolution and community mediation. He expresses genuine remorse for the harm his actions caused, his probation officer had written in the most recent update. His current work demonstrates understanding that leadership requires serving others rather than personal enrichment. The house where Richard once lived had become our community center, complete with meeting rooms that smelled like fresh paint and democratic possibility rather than fear and manipulation. I taught monthly workshops on HOA governance and resident rights, sharing practical knowledge that could prevent future neighborhood disasters. My favorite part was watching new residents' faces when they realized they'd moved somewhere that actually encouraged participation rather than just collecting dues and issuing arbitrary violations. The workshops consistently filled to capacity because people craved genuine information about their rights and responsibilities in community governance. My relationship with Jennifer, a teacher who'd moved into the neighborhood during our community organizing campaign, had evolved from crisis partnership into something permanent that made me excited about building long-term roots. My home office had become the unofficial neighborhood IT support center, helping elderly residents navigate online participation in HOA meetings and community forums. The newest family moving into our renovated community center house received the full Maple Grove welcome. Homemade cookies from Mrs. Johnson, help setting up utilities from the Martinez family, and complete neighborhood history delivered with enough humor to make civic education entertaining rather than overwhelming. Their kids immediately joined the Sidewalk Chalk Cooperative and Youth Volleyball League, proof that we'd actually created the kind of place where children could grow up feeling safe, included, and excited about community participation, rather than learning to fear arbitrary authority. Standing in my backyard last weekend, watching neighbors gather for another impromptu barbecue while kids played freely in streets that felt genuinely safe, I realized we'd learned something more valuable than how to fight corrupt board members. We'd discovered how to build communities so democratically engaged and transparently governed that corruption becomes nearly impossible to sustain. The blue door that started everything now marked the entrance to a neighborhood where people chose collaborative problem-solving over isolated submission to arbitrary rules. Got your own HOA nightmare story? Drop it in the comments below and share your experiences with the community, because these situations are everywhere, and you're definitely not alone. There are legal ways to fight back that don't require federal investigations or financial fraud prosecutions. Smash that subscribe button for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to back down when petty tyrants tried to exploit their communities. Because sometimes the best way to deal with corrupt leadership is to out-organize them with transparency, persistence, and really good documentation of everything they're doing wrong. From all of us here at Community Victory Stories, thanks for watching today's HOA Corruption Takedown. If you enjoyed seeing neighbors stand their ground and democracy triumph over fraud, hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you won't miss the next community organizing victory we bring you.